Good evening, everyone. My name is Ayşe Parla, and I'm faculty at the Department of Anthropology at Boston University. It is my great pleasure today to welcome you all to the 2019 lecture of the Campagna-Kerven Lecture series on modern Turkey. This is the 24th year of the Campagna-Kerven Lectures, which have been held annually since 1996. The event today is hosted by the Party School and the Institute for Muslim Studies and Civilizations. And I'd like to extend a huge thanks to the organizing committee, Emine Fetvacı, Roberta Mikhailov, Betty Anderson, Tom Barfield, and Assistant Director at the Institute, James Souza. Before proceeding to introduce our distinguished speaker for this year's lecture, I would like to take a moment to pause and pay tribute to the cherished memory of Professor Richard Norton, eminent political scientist and beloved colleague and teacher. Professor Norton had been organizing this lecture series since its inception. I had the privilege of getting to know Professor Norton only via email correspondence in the months before his passing away this February. During our correspondence, not only did he generously share his expert knowledge and wisdom, but I also got my own glimpse of the kindness, dignity, and warmth so many in the EU community have expressed as being among Dr. Norton's many exceptional qualities as a scholar and as a colleague. So now I would like to invite Dr. Houshang Shehabi, Professor of International Relations and History at the Party School, to say a few words to honor the legacy of Dr. Augustus Richard Norton.
Thank you. It's the passing of Dr. Norton was really a blow to all of us, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about him. He was born in Brooklyn in 1946 and was commissioned from the ranks in 1966. He served 2 combat tours in Vietnam and then served in the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization in southern Lebanon as an unarmed UN observer. In 1981, he joined the faculty of the United States Military Academy, better known as West Point, where he became a professor of political science after receiving his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago in 1984. He joined Boston University in 1993, what was then known as the Department of International Relations, and has now become the Pardee School of Global Studies. And in 1996, he also joined the anthropology department here at BU. His research experience in the Middle East spanned nearly 3 decades, including residences in Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, Kuwait, and Lebanon. Lebanon became the focus of his research, and he published many books and articles. Some of them are still considered seminal works that one has to read. In the 1990s, Dick Norton headed an ambitious 3-year project funded by the Ford Foundation that examined state-society relations in the Middle East. The project resulted in his widely cited 2-volume edited work, Civil Society in the Middle East. He battled cancer for many years and after a courageous struggle passed away on February 20th, 2019. His legacy at BU is very rich. He trained hundreds, if not thousands, of students in the time that he was here. He founded the Institute for Iraqi Studies, which we still have. But of course, his most important legacy is the Campagna-Kerven Lecture series, which brings us together here. And about that, I ask Professor Parla to come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shahabi, for this testimonial. In my own brief but edifying correspondence with Professor Norton, I learned several important facts about the Campagna-Kerven Lectures. The lecture series is largely funded by the late Suzanne Campagna, who launched the series to spark students' curiosity in the economy, culture, and politics of modern Turkey. She initiated the lectures in memory of her father, Mehmet Nahit Kerven, and her departed husband, Gerard Campagna. And Gerard Campagna himself received his PhD in history at BU. He was a bibliophile and donated many of the volumes in his collection to Boston University's Mugar Library, on which we will learn a little bit more in a minute. The generosity of Suzanne Campagna also includes funds for a fellowship awarded each year to a BU PhD student whose dissertation focus is on modern Turkey. So this is what Professor Norton wrote to me about Suzanne Campagna. Quote, "She was a remarkable woman and I cherish her memory. Many who met her were impressed by her clarity of thought, her selflessness, and her intellectual curiosity." End of quote. The Campagna-Kerven Lectures have hosted experts, scholars, and artists from many fields and walks of life with the common aim of fostering informed public debate on key issues pertaining to modern Turkey. Indeed, the scope of invited speakers to date has been immensely broad, spanning entrepreneurs, cartoonists, novelists, business people, journalists, as well as academics. Our speaker this year is a brilliant and prolific historian of the modern Middle East, Dr. Lerna Ekmekçioğlu. She is McMillan-Stewart Associate Professor of History at MIT, as well as an affiliate of the Women and Gender Studies program and the Center for International Studies. In his endorsement of the unanimous decision of this year's selection committee, Professor Norton wrote that Dr. Ekmekçioğlu would, and I quote, "open an important historical vista for the lecture series," end of quote. Indeed, for more than a decade, Dr. Ekmekçioğlu has been assiduously, courageously, eloquently opening vistas in the fields of Armenian, Ottoman, and modern Turkish history. After a BA in sociology from Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, Dr. Ekmekçioğlu received her MA and her PhD in the joint program in history and Middle Eastern and Islamic studies at New York University. She has held a Manukyan postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Michigan and was a Dumanyan visiting professor in Armenian studies in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. Her widely cited publications include articles in such flagship journals as the International Journal of Middle East Studies and Comparative Studies in Society and History. Dr. Ekmekçioğlu's first book is co-edited with Melissa Bilal and is entitled Bir Adalet Feryadı, A Cry for Justice. It traces the lives and works of 5 Armenian feminist writers through the late Ottoman Empire and the early Turkish Republic. The book became so popular in Turkey that it went through numerous editions, and for many of us became a staple in our courses on feminism, gender, and sexuality in the Middle East. Dr. Ekmekçioğlu's second book, entitled Recovering Armenia, The Limits of Belonging in Post-Genocide Turkey, was published by Stanford University Press in 2016. The book has recently won the Der Mugurdiçyan Outstanding Book Award. Recovering Armenia is a pioneering historical account of how Armenian survivors of the genocide inventively reconstituted themselves within the new Turkish Republic. In this beautifully crafted book overall, especially inspirational for me, is the paradox Dr. Ekmekçioğlu explores with archival rigor, theoretical nuance, subtlety, and poignancy, namely how someone could be an Armenian and a feminist in the post-genocidal landscape of Turkey, when maintaining one's identity as Armenian and as a genocide survivor relied so heavily on traditionally gendered roles and expectations. Dr. Ekmekçioğlu is currently working with Melissa Bilal on a third book, a critical anthology of the history of Western Armenian feminism, entitled Feminism in Armenian, an Interpretive Anthology. Finally, To add to her luminous record of research and writing, Professor Ekmekçioğlu received in 2016 the Leviton Teaching Award at MIT's School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lerna Ekmekçioğlu.
Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you all for coming. Is mic working? Is everything infrastructurally good? Yeah. Good. Thank you so much, Ayşe, for choosing me together with your colleagues, Emine Fetvacı and Roberta Michela, as the first person under your leadership to deliver the Campagna-Kerven Lecture. I have been aware of this lecture series, obviously, since I've been at MIT for 8 years, and I have been secretly hoping that one day I would make it here. And I'm so glad that under Ayşe Parla's and her colleagues' jurisdiction, I'm here today. She mentioned that Campagna, that's how we pronounce it, Campagna, Gerard Campagna, in 1952, actually, she graduated from a history program here. He had his PhD from BU in 1952, and he has been a history buff, I think, in general, and eventually he donated most of his books and collections to the Boston University Library, which is named Mughal Library, which to some of us in this room is obviously a very familiar name because it is Mıgırdıçyan. This is the same family that of the Stephen Mugar and his sister, kids, all that huge Mugar family, who are known for their philanthropic activities, especially towards educational institutions as well as some Armenian institutions, including Nasser, here in our region. So the person who in 1966 donated a significant amount of money to Mughal Library, to this library at BU that became Mughal Library, was an Armenian from the Ottoman Empire, from Harput, currently in Elazığ, who was born there in 1901. He had to they left the family, part of the family left the Ottoman land from Harput beginning in the 1905, 6, 7, partially as a response to the massacres and the bloodbath that visited Harput in the Hamidian era from 1894 to 1896. Some of them came here. Stepan and the family had a restaurant on Mass Avenue, after which they expanded their business and he bought the Star Market. You know, like most of the money for this library comes from the Star Market chain. And the remaining parts of the family, about 25 of them, perished during the 1915 Armenian genocide. Stepan named this is called a memorial library, I think Mughal, in the name of his parents, he gave the money, which I think is a good segue way for me to start my own presentation, which is about the immediate aftermath of the genocide, but not in Harput or in the Ottoman provinces, but specifically in the Ottoman capital, Constantinople, which became Istanbul. Okay, so I am going to deliver my classic now book talk. Some of you have listened to it before. I'm a bit conscious of it. I'm going to try to not to think about this. But this is definitely my first in this region in the last year and a half. So my principal intellectual project, as someone from Turkey myself, Armenian from Turkey, half Armenian name, half Turkish name, last name Turkish, first name Armenian, the project has been trying to understand this question. How can a people survive a genocide, a quintessential attack against their very peoplehood? But more specifically, how did those who survived the Armenian genocide and continued living inside the perpetrator state survive the new Turkey? I have studied the question of Armenian survival in two distinct periods. So I'm going to follow in today's talk the trajectory of the chronological narrative of the book itself. So this is the timeline. The first period starts with the Mudros Armistice, the signing of the Armistice, which sealed the Ottoman defeat. And the period lasts until September 1922, when the Kemalist Turkish nationalist forces sealed their victory against the Allies and against Armenian territorial demands. I'm assuming some historical background here, but I'm more than happy to explain things further, even factual things, in the question and answer section. Then there is this 1 year of, let's see, of course, doesn't matter, 1 year of 1922, 1923, which marks the signing. 23 is the most important moment for history of modern Turkey, really, because it is the birth of modern Turkey. As we know it, the Lausanne Treaty is signed in 1923 or ratified. So it is it's the beginning of a new era. And then the second period is from 1923 to 1933, a decade after the establishment of Turkey as a republic, as well as the closing, the folding of this main primary source that I used initially to understand this whole historical era and its main actors. This journal called Haygin, which also happens to be a women's journal. In terms of my subjects, the historical subjects that I focused, I looked at the perspective worldviews of Armenian spokespeople, lay and religious leaders, intelligentsia, and all others who took it upon themselves to write and speak on behalf of Turkish Armenians. I wrote the book by reading the Armenian press of the time in Istanbul, Armenian and Turkish memoirs about the era, institutional reports, published and unpublished correspondence amongst intellectuals, Turkish state archives, and Turkish newspapers. So it is very much of a text-based project, including the visuals, anything that is published. It is focused on Istanbul, and there are several reasons for that, and it is important to understand why. The Armenian Patriarchate, which is the religious and civil center of Armenian leadership, was located in Istanbul. So it was established in 1461 by the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmet II, and the building has remained in the same place since then. So it's like where the political civil center, religious also center is. Being the Ottoman, so also demographically, in the period that I studied, immediate post-genocide years, more than about 75% of all Armenian remaining surviving Armenians were in the capital for various reasons that I'll touch upon. By Armenians, I mean openly Armenian people. I'm not talking about crypto-Armenians, the people who had to convert to Muslim during the genocide, and then they have their own ways of identifying. It's not the focus here. The third reason, which is very important, is the fact that the Ottoman capital experienced the genocide years, war years in general, very differently. Even though about 250 professional leadership, the brain team of the Armenians, were deported beginning on the 24th of April 1915 by the orders of the Ottoman government, and most of them perished. The population itself, Constantinopolitan Armenians, were not eliminated. They stayed put, more or less, which meant that not just the people, but the institutions, orphanages, schools, churches, hospitals that the Armenian community owned and operated remained intact, which would become such an important asset after the genocide when these survivors dispersed then in Mesopotamia were, as a consequence of the Mudros Armistice, were allowed to return to their places of origin. Majority of them couldn't return to their places of origin. Let's say Harput, most likely they weren't able to return, but they could return to Istanbul. And there are reasons for that. The most important of which being Istanbul was under Allied occupation. So in the first period that I'm studying, right after the Armistice, effectively the British, the victorious powers of the World War I, arrived Constantinople and occupied the capital, which lasted until September 1922. So this is during this time that about 30,000 Armenian refugees, survivors or deportees, entered Istanbul as refugees. And at the time, there were about 120,000 Armenians in Istanbul. And they were the main people to take care of these incoming refugees. It's not the Allied powers, or it's not the remaining Turkish government itself that had to organize for self-help and other things. Istanbul is also unique and important because after 1922, no Armenian periodical or book gets to be published in Turkey during the years that I'm studying. Well, maybe until now, actually, not anywhere in Turkey, but in Istanbul. So if you are looking at the textual worldviews, public stances, reflexes, you had to study Istanbul. So this is an image that helps me understand how I conceptualize my work. It is a matryoshka doll, as you see. The outer layer, these are like different, I guess, like rings of analysis. The outer one is the international context, as well as the immediate Turkish political context. The second one is the Armenian responses to these international things. Of course, they are it's just like a device, really. They are formed in response to each other, but I try to understand how these people who just went through such trouble looked at the world and responded in various ways. Then my argument is that gender was an important part of their responses, which is the third layer. This gender, I already mentioned the gist of the book, which I'm not going to focus a lot in this talk, is that I'm arguing that it's an integral part of survival, to return to this survival kit called gender, which involves a patriarchal traditional family structure. You don't need to be confused about it at this stage. And then the last one, I think the one which is still intact, is the Armenian feminist responses to this gendered ways of survival, which has to hold on to patriarchy. But there are some feminists who are equally invested in the betterment of their sex, as well as conservation of whatever grouphood they are left with after the genocide. So the first slide that I'm going to show is the one that summarizes, I think, the worldviews of the Armenian public in the immediate post-war years under Allied occupation, in Istanbul under Allied occupation. But it's not in Istanbul. I actually think now more and more that it's this Armenian general public worldview. But it is a bold claim. We are not supposed to talk about the Armenian public. It is monolithic. We talk about heterogeneity. You cannot have one type of public opinion. But politically and perhaps psychologically speaking, at this moment, I think Armenians worldwide were politically united, more or less, as they had never been before, and as they would never be again. And there were historical and political reasons for it. So first of all, the genocidal violence anywhere, this kind of violence unites people. This is the productive value of group violence. Your group identity gets even more stronger after it is attacked as a group identity. And the immediate aftermath of the war was a remarkable moment for Armenians because of a number of reasons. First of all, the perpetrator state was defeated. The Ottoman Empire came out of World War I as defeated. The government that took the country to war, the government, the triumvirate, and the people around them that orchestrated this elimination campaign that we now call the Armenian Genocide, escaped the country the same day after the night, in shame, after the signing of the Mudros Armistice. So they can totally see that the bad guys, the main bad guys that like created this whole debacle, had to leave. Allied victory and Allied occupation. not just of Constantinople, but a lot of other parts of Anatolia as well. This is also something that would inspire hope for the survivors, and the existence of a country called the Republic of Armenia in Transcaucasia, which was founded by Russian Armenians. So obviously towards the Caucasus, Russian army, during the Bolshevik Revolution, in the upheaval of that revolution, Russian Armenians managed to declare independence in May 1918. So by the time that the Mudros Armistice is signed, there is a republic, there is an independent entity that has sovereignty, territorial sovereignty, called Armenia, and representatives of which came to, before the armistice signed, some representatives from the Republic of Armenia, independent of Republic, came to Istanbul to sign or to have negotiations with even Talat Pasha, the main person who was leading the country during the war. There was a representative. So it was a legitimate, like Turkish officials at the time recognized the Republic of Armenia. So this is also, from the survivors' perspective, it's and the last time that Armenians had territorial sovereignty before 1918 was in 1325 in the Kilikia. So it is a big deal for Armenians in general, but also because it is immediate aftermath of a catastrophe, existential catastrophe. That they were ideologically united as never before does not mean that there were no political parties and fractions, but there were some goals around which all Armenians, I argue, agreed. One of them was this thing, really, called Askayın Veradunund, which is national rebirth. It means rebirth, but it also meant, like, there is a huge vocabulary when you look at the press of the time that delineate some kind of recovery, revival, rehabilitation, reconstitution, re-establishment, restoration, which is one of the reasons why my title of the book is Recovering Armenia. So how were the Armenian elite to recover Armenia? By doing a number of things, but most importantly, by making sure that there was a state called United Greater Armenia. The goal was these parts of the parts of the Ottoman Empire that the Ottomans usually refer to as their eastern provinces or their 6 vilayets, that are the ones that Armenians claim to be their part of the ancestral homeland, that they are indigenous to this land. After the war, Armenians now get organized in various parts of the world to claim independence from the Ottoman Empire and unite that Ottoman Armenian parts with the Russian Armenian parts in Transcaucasia and established Greater Mother Armenia. Armenians, including those in Istanbul, lobbied among, of course, where great powers in Paris. So because this is the beginning in January 1919, Paris Peace Conference is happening, Woodrow Wilson is there. So now the world map is going to be redrawn, and Armenians, by various delegations, doing significant lobbying work, all kinds of propaganda, in order to convince the Western public opinion that it was them and not the Turks or Kurds who had to have territorial sovereignty in those contested lands. So it's expanded statehood. It was a part of the Armenian recovery or rebirth, because unlike the pre-war era, after 1915, there were no Armenian political organizations that imagined the future of Armenians inside Ottoman Turkey, which is very different from the previous. Even right before the genocide, there are Armenian political parties who are still asking for self-rule, autonomy, reform, definitely reform. So it's it's a small minority of Armenians who are going for full-fledged independence. But after the war, they're done, basically, and all hopes are gone. And there is enough conjuncture, international, that they can actually think of uniting, basically reclaiming their ancestral land and having expanded statehood. It was called the Armenian cause, Haytat, which they formulated as a right to national self-determination the Wilsonian principle that dominated the post-war diplomatic parlance. So there are many nations like Armenia who are in Paris trying to claim that they are entitled to this land. So in this picture, so let me read this picture. I think the rock can be read as the Armenian father. This is on the cover of an Armenian almanac that was published in 1920. It has a religious Sargavakin Daretut, but it has inside of it is nothing to do. It says it's not religious. And 21 is very important, but I chose this because of the childlike figures and that it is colored. And then it's all gendered in such classical ways. It's a boy soldier. The rock, the fatherland, is defended by a boy soldier committed to kill and die in the name of the nation, and a girl nurse in Red Cross uniform ready to attend the wounded. The two figures complement each other and neatly divide the national labor along gendered lines. They look like they are siblings, comrades in action, but they could be seen as a bride and groom, as the piece is somewhat reminiscent of a wedding picture. She is in white and veiled. He is in formal black. She touches him. He holds a firearm at the ready. If you lived in that era and were reading the newspapers, you would not find it too far-stretched to see this girl as the mother of this boy, or as a metaphoric mother. As he touches him, as she touches him, she passes courage, knowledge, and memory. Askayin Veradunund, I argue, was a gendered project. It implicated women and men differently to the main Armenian goals of survival and recovery. Therefore, its consequences for women and men Armenians and boys and girls were different. Armenians taught about survival and recovery through a familial language. Even people who stood at the opposite end of the political spectrum, Armenians, who would in other ways would be ready to kill each other because they hated each other so much, regardless of their sexes, feminist, non-feminist alike, were in basic agreement that the institution of the family was to play a fundamental role in national restoration. The Turk, usually in singular, had attacked the Armenian family, violated mothers, sisters, and wives, kidnapped daughters and sons. I know that rape and abduction happened, but it's never rape and abduction of women. It's rape and abduction of mothers, daughters, sisters, and killed husbands, fathers, and brothers. Therefore, national rebirth had to start by reconnecting the broken pieces of the nation. Armenian leaders spent immense energy, money, and time to find orphans and rehabilitate them, to collect Armenian women and girls from inside Muslim households and orphanages, to reintegrate them to their natal community by re-Armenianizing them and ideally marrying them off to proper Armenian men. That is why I chose for my book cover, where is it? This picture of an orphaned girl, Yeranuhi Kevonyan, who was likely abducted previously, but then rescued by Armenians after the Mudros Armistice, because Mudros Armistice stipulated that the prisoners of war had to be released. And they read it, no one studied it yet, but they read this article of prisoner of war to include also women and kids kidnapped during the war. So Armenians had the right, really, after the armistice, to reclaim their kidnapped people. And this wedding, the groom is not an orphan, and it's mostly his family, and the other, it happened in front of an orphanage, which was such a common occurrence. Remnants had to find each other and form new families. The new families would reproduce new Armenians, who would then inhabit the soon-to-be established Mother Armenia. This was, I gather, was the general narrative. Predictably, pronatalist calls were very common. At one point, the Armenian Patriarchate debated if they should impose extra taxes on single people. And these pronatalist campaigns placed women at the heart of the discourse. Abortion was equated with infanticide and treason, and abortion-seeking Armenian women were branded, even if they were refugees who were impregnated during their time of captivity, they were branded as egotistic and degenerate. Armenian authorities denied abortion even to those refugees who were pregnant at the time of their rescue from Muslim households. In a reversal of the former patrilineal rules, every baby born to an Armenian woman at this period was considered full-fledged Armenian, regardless of the father's Muslim background. The body of a minor child, future father or mother, symbolized the hope for repair, remembrance, and revenge as living in and of itself, was seen as a political act and the ultimate vengeance that Armenians could take from the enemy. This emphasis on the well-being of the nation's fetuses, babies, children, and families was not just, I'm arguing, a manic response to genocide. I think it was. Certainly, we see this after all genocides, probably, this hyper attention to the new birth. But there were other anxieties, a lot of them related to the connection between demographics and territory that led to this almost obsession, really. The Paris peace settlement negotiations, with their emphasis on Wilsonian self-determination, came to an agreement that the nationality of a region was to devolve to the group that made up the majority of the population. The primacy of the principle of self-determination in the aftermath of the Great War escalated the importance of numbers, statistics, thus of sex and the womb. And this did not fit well for Armenians, as they had just came out of a genocide. I'm cutting the story short here. I just decided. You know the end. Armenians did not get any land. I mean, they came out of the Paris system defeated, fully defeated. It is almost like their second catastrophe back to back. They even lost part of what they had. As the Allies failed them, Armenians failed because they said that they were going to support them. They didn't. It's not surprising for us. But it is very surprising for even very smart people who were acting at that time as the leaders. The international community not only allowed the Ottoman Muslims to keep eastern and southern Anatolia, part of modern Turkey today, as their own, but with the signing of the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne, amnestied all war crimes committed from 1915 to 1923. So there's some debate about there, but there is an amnesty statement for sure. In late 1920, as a consequence of being attacked by the Kemalist forces, the Republic of Armenia relinquished its independence and accepted Sovietization. So that tiny little Transcaucasian Republic by Russian Armenians lasted only for 22 months. It became part of Soviet Union. And the Allies started evacuating beginning in 1923, actually with the French being the first one who evacuated their occupation forces from northern Syria, southern Turkey today. So, but for our purposes, which is the Istanbul perspective, it was the ultimate Kemalist victory, Mustafa Kemal's nationalist Muslim alliance, that are fighting against the occupying forces, against Greek, Armenian, and allied territorial ambitions. So the Kemalists, let me see. So I'm going to talk about this part here, Izmir. Ultimate Kemalist victory against the Greeks in Western Anatolia in September 1922 that led Armenians Istanbul into panic. The events in Izmir or Smyrna, especially how the incoming Turkish forces would because they had been occupying. The Greeks, with the support of the British, had occupied there for almost 2 years. But eventually the Kemalist forces came and managed to get rid of the Greeks. But during this process, a lot of local Greeks and Armenians also suffered. Basically, they were massacred, as well as some Turkish groups. The army also attacked some of the local Turkish people there. the burning of the city is this most important, infamous Greek catastrophe, because Izmir being mainly a Greek almost majority place. When they are watching this, September 1922, Istanbul Armenians and Istanbul Greeks really panic, because they think that whatever happened so now that the Kemalists are so strong, whatever happened in Izmir is going to replicate in Istanbul. And only in the September and October of 1922, 50,000 Armenians and Greeks fled the city, the capital, which is this. You don't need to know anything about this. I just use this as a symbol, because when you look at the newspapers of the time, Armenian newspapers, and I suspect Greek newspapers had to be same way, it's all about like ferries, transatlantics, immediate departure from Istanbul, through Piraeus, through Marseille. Like you feel that people are, especially people who collaborated with the Allies, because they did. Like it's like the self-fulfilling prophecy of the whole genocide. After the genocide, Armenians are doing what Turks thought, the Turkish leadership thought they were doing before the genocide. Much to the relief of those people who fled, they call it like self-infused exile or exodus. It's a real exodus, really, in panic. What they feared most did not materialize, meaning the Kemalist entry to the city. Of course, Turks got back the city, but it turned out to be a diplomatic affair rather than a violent encounter. Even though there was no burning, no like real fighting, but about 2,000 Greeks and Armenians and their dependents who stayed and like took the risk of checking what's going to happen to them after the Kemalists entered the city, they were expelled for collaborating with the British. Importantly, those who fled the country, not just the ones who were expelled for collaboration, but the ones who voluntarily left, those 50,000 more or less people who left the city, were never able to return home. Turkey denied them re-entry and confiscated their property. These Armenians thus joined thousands of dispersed others scattered around the world as a result of the earlier genocide, trying to build new lives in various places, including in Boston. So this is like the 2/3 of the book, let's say, or half. The last second part is about the ones who remained back at home in Constantinople. What happened to them? They became a minority community. So the Lausanne Treaty, that the Ankara government, so these Kemalists really consolidated themselves at this point and got rid of the Sultanate. This is the end of the real Ottoman dynasty that ruled for 600. And it was the only Turkish representative to this new conference, Lausanne Conference, is the last peace treaty of the post-war system. Ankara government was the only representative, and they were representative of the Allies. According to the treaty, all non-Muslim nationals of Turkey were designated legally as minorities. Religion was the only criterion that was employed for deferral of the minority status. The treaty, effectively, because they were non-Muslims, Armenians, Greeks, and Jews in Turkey acquired some extra rights that differed from the rights of the majority. The treaty stipulated that minorities would have freedom to conduct their religious affairs, use their mother tongues freely, continue their press, conduct the affairs of their educational and charitable institutions, and continue using their customs in personal status law. These were minority protection rights that the Allied powers forced on Turkey, as they did force similar clauses on 15 other defeated, newly established, or expanded European states, such as Hungary, Australia, Romania, Czechoslovakia, among others. So interwar Turkey, as much as it is inevitably similar to Iran, which we were talking about, actually acts as a European, effectively, because of these minority treaties, acts as a European power rather than a Middle Eastern power. The Turkish delegation at the Lausanne Conference did not want to confer those rights to minorities. None of these states on which minority protections were forced wanted to accept them, obviously, right? So Turkish delegation also resisted, but they had to give up. They compromised at the end, even though they saw it is marked like to this day. And so Lausanne is still in effect. It is, but these minority protections rights, which are usually seen even then and today is seen as privileges by the majority rather than rights, they were seen by the government, by the representative, Ankara representative at Lausanne, as well as the parliamentarians back in Ankara, as the infringement of Turkish sovereignty, especially because they were going to quote from the treaty. These minority protections are, quote, constitute obligations of international concern, and thus placed under the guarantee of the League of Nations. So if you know your Ottoman history, you know that this would open up a really difficult box of like, they are out there, others intervening, they will collaborate again, they'll continue their collaboration with our enemies within the Western powers. So it's like Western power intervention syndrome triggered. For good reasons. After the war years, I think it's very justified, actually. But because the League, this newly constituted League of Nations, in fact, did not have any muscle to check over Turkey or for any other state, Turkey breached most of these minority rights. Let me do some numbers. So, according to the first census of the Republic of Turkey in 1927, of the 13 million Turkish citizens, about 75,000 of them were Armenians. So non-Muslims are 350,000 people, more or less. This census is very questionable. They only ask for the mother tongues. But we don't have anything else, so we are using it. But it's a significant number. Like 3% is a lot more than what is now. So the new country's laws and regulations excluded non-Muslims from the emergent category of the Turk. So I'm talking about the breaches now. So the Lausanne Treaty says explicitly that these minority clauses, Article 37 to 45, should not constitute as ground for discrimination. It says that. However, it doesn't work out in reality like that, because from 1923 on, laws banned minorities from careers in the military and civil bureaucracy, from traveling freely inside the country, and from free association, and specifically about minorities. Which doesn't include the Kurds, I assume is very clear, because they are not non-Muslim. They are Muslims, so they are not given the minority title. Minorities weren't even allowed to establish Boy Scout groups, let alone political parties. This is a single-party authoritarian state, so no one is enjoying a lot of freedom, but there are some added and unique kind of burdens for minorities stemming from the state's mistrust and how they are seen as the continuation of Western expansionism and imperialism as enemies within, or the fifth column, really. But exclusion and discrimination, let me check something. Yes. But exclusion and discrimination coexisted with forcible assimilation and invitation to belong. As a result of this entangled history, Ottoman entangled history, and inherent conflicts in its various agendas, the Turkish Republic's various goals at the same, trying to do a lot of things because it had to really, as this new and rather vulnerable state, the Turkish state treated minorities not consistently, but paradoxically. It's one of the major arguments of the book. In 1926, the Turkish state passed a new and secular civil code modeled after the Swiss example, Medeni Kanun, and it pressed each non-Muslim community to give up their Lausanne-granted rights to use their canonical law custom tradition in matters pertaining to personal status law or family law, inheritance, marriage, divorce, alimony. So this was in 1926, which was the end of legal pluralism. in Turkey, and therefore I consider this the end of the millet system, actually, which is a huge difference from similar countries. It's secular. In 1930, I mean, the reasoning was that because the new civil code is secular in nature and is not Islamic, it had to be shared by everyone. In 1934, the new surname law allowed, and sometimes even required, everyone, including non-Muslims, to take Turkish last names. Not Armenians only, Greeks, Arabs, Albanians, everyone had to take a Turkish last name. That's why my last name is in Turkish, because they had to translate it to Turkish. But there were some people who were able to keep their previous last name for specific reasons. The best example that some of us in this room know very well, in 1933, the Turkish Ministry of Education passed new legislation obligating primary school students to recite a short poem called Student's Pledge every school morning, Andımız. The poem started with, quote, I am a Turk, I'm righteous, I'm hardworking, and ended with, quote, I commit my being to the existence of Turks. Minority schools were not exempted from this obligation, which remained in effect until October 2013. Some Kurdish efforts and the Islamist government various goals allowed it to be eliminated. But it was every day for 5 days, every morning, every primary school student in Turkey had to face also Mustafa Kemal's picture, and as standing up, they had to recite this collectively. Effectively then, Turkey forced all Turkish citizen children to affirm their Turkness every day, even as it denied some of these children their fundamental citizenship rights on the basis of their non-Turkness. Didn't this make Armenians dizzy? Didn't they get confused about the simultaneity of estrangement and invitation to belong? How did they live under such conditions in the land of unapologetic perpetrators who continued to resent their presence? How could Armenians belong to post-genocide Turkey? In a nutshell, by relying on their past and by making good use of whatever freedoms they had, as they did, even after the Turkish government's breach of the Treaty of Lausanne, they retained, and to this day they retain, minorities, including Armenians, some room for self-government and autonomy. My overarching argument is that Armenians' centuries-long experience under Ottoman rule equipped them with the necessary institutional, communal, and mental repertoires to continue living, even thriving in the new Turkey. So it is somewhat anachronistic, I eventually understood, to ask like this dizzying question. I think it's legitimate, I'm not taking back, but it was certainly easier for them than what we imagined it was. Simply because they were closer in time, which also sounds paradoxical. Okay, so I'm going to try to explain a bit more. Since the Islamic Ottoman Empire and the secular Turkish Republic bore much continuity, Armenians' boundary-making mechanisms and protective reflexes proved to be transferable from one context to the other. So it's almost like we don't use it, like I don't use it in my teaching, I don't even use it, I think, in the book, I'm not sure, but it's like they are used to being second-class citizens, so it's not a big shock for them. They were able to be second-class citizens and be very rich, very happy, or very poor and desperate like the others. This was especially the case because the rights, so in terms of continuity between the empire and the republic, the rights that the Lausanne Treaty granted to minorities, such as over schools, courts, language, and charitable institutions, eerily resembled the entitlements that Ottoman non-Muslims, the Dhimma, had enjoyed, or the Zimmi, enjoyed for about half a millennium within the confines of what is conventionally referred to as the millet system. I refer to minorities in post-Lausanne Turkey as secular dhimmis of the Republic, an oxymoron which self-consciously places an Islamic legal category, dhimmi, in the framework of a secular majority Muslim state. The most important communal survival strategy that Turkish Armenian spoke people developed in the 1920s and 30s was loyalty. It's the ultimate dhimmi posture, really. Basically worshipping the leader and making a huge deal out of it, like dramatically, theatrically, insisting that they are with this new leader, blonde, blue-eyed, Western-looking, civilized-looking, new-looking, tuxedo-wearing, hope-inducing, anti-Ottoman, anti-Islamist, anti-Islamlardır, leader called Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. They distanced up, so the same group that I'm following, the ones who remained, Armenian leadership, political leaders, religious leaders, intellectuals, they also distanced themselves from Western powers explicitly, asked them, they are screaming about these things, to stop intervening on behalf of Armenians, and they distance themselves from Armenians in the diaspora, who Turkish Armenians framed as being anti-Turkish, pursuing anti-Turkish agendas, such as lobbying for, they created the bad diaspora to make themselves look good, because they had to. Another strategy was keeping silent, at least publicly, again very dhimmi, for those of you who know the Islamic history, especially about the violent past, both the wartime deportation and massacres, but also the years of Allied occupation where Armenians collaborated with the Allies against the Ottoman Turks. New Turkey's rulers, including its leader, consciously endorsed the perpetrators. A lot of the leaders of the genocide became ministers, including Minister of Justice. They held important positions of political power, but Armenians never talked about it, as now I think it's clear to all of us. While also they endorsed Turkification, like surname law, you would think that they would be upset. No, they are very happy. The way you look at it from the public, I didn't do oral history interviews about this particularly. I'm not looking at the private kinship sphere, how Armenians are dealing with this trauma. But in terms of their public presentation, they love that they are being Turkified, with their last names turning into Turks, because now we are accepted as not the step-sons of this country, but the native sons, something like that, along those lines. But this is not the whole story, obviously, because it wouldn't be interesting otherwise. Not that this is extremely interesting, but what's coming is interesting, because this one is the summary of this posture that Turkification didn't mean that they were loving to become Turks. They are not willing to give up on what they think are the assertions of Armenianness, the most important of which being the language. So they have religious freedom. So they have the church, like Lausanne Treaty's religious freedom acts are being observed, right? Because it's so millet system. It's so like the Turkish state also has that continuation. So this picture summarizes this, because this this appeared at in the cover of an almanac published in 1930 in Istanbul, the National Hospital's almanac. So as they were promoting public Turkification for their community, Armenian literati also advocated the maintenance of an Armenian essence, mother tongue, customs, traditions, memory inside the private sphere of the community, composed of families, kinship groups, churches, schools, etc. And this, of course, was a gendered process. The repertoires that informed how Armenians responded to minoritization had a gendered blueprint. They implicated women and men differently in the project of recovering Armenianness in the home of its most reluctant host. This is a picture that this mother and child intimate putting to sleep lullaby picture was chosen for this almanac's cover because in this issue, the Armenian patriarch of the time, the most important person, like a chief rabbi, Mesrop Naroyan, wrote a piece called The Armenian Language and Its Instruction. The patriarch in the text, says that he's alarmed that Armenian parents have started communicating with the little children in foreign tongues, Odarlezo. He asserted that, quote, the teaching and learning of Armenian language is a must for every single Armenian, and that especially at home and with children, it would be unacceptable to use any other language but Armenian. Not surprisingly, the patriarch singled out the mothers and wrote, quote, like sacred mother's milk, the child has to imbibe the charm of his nation's language through maternal love. So it's like he's talking about affective transmission here, I think. It is crucial responsibility of educated mothers, because scientific housewifery and education already happened amongst Armenians, educated mothers to impress their beloved children with the marvelous language of Mashtot, the inventor of the Armenian alphabet, and he adds, oh, those first impressions and those first maternal sensations, they are indelible and indestructible. So clearly she's transmitting the charm. The piece, this is also very expected, very common. In general, we see this mothers as the mothers of the nation, protective savior transmitter role, which is gendered. But it gets interesting here because it was written in 1929 at the height of citizen-initiated, state-sponsored campaign called Citizens Speak Turkish, Vatandaş Türkçe Konuş. At this time, foreign nationals as well as Turkish citizens were being harassed and punished for speaking languages other than Turkish in the streets, on ferries, in movie theaters, and in other public places. That the patriarch wrote such a piece where the household and mothers were seen as beacons of Armenian continuity, because he insistently says in the piece that you should speak it at home, you should speak it at home, you should speak it at home. Because the Turkish state stops really at the threshold of the household. In such an unwelcome environment, this suggests that how the gendered patriarchal family proved to be a survival kit for Armenians. That Armenianness could only be recovered or sustained by relying on the traditional family structure was a challenge for, other than church going, of course, was a challenge for feminists who were equally invested in the betterment of their sex and maintenance of their community. So, this is the part about which I'm going to come talk in 5 years, I hope, again. Because this is the part that I've developed in the book. I never have time to talk about it in my book talks, but that's why I am writing a new book about the topic, where she is the leader of Armenian feminism in post-genocide Turkey. This is a really interesting phenomenon for women's history, for feminist history, Armenian history, Ottoman history, genocide history as well, because Armenian feminism lives its heyday in post-war Istanbul, because of so many intersections of politics, people, time. This is when women are getting their suffrage rights in general, right? Including in here, the war, the catalyzer, the war, what happened during the war gave a lot of energy to the feminist movement. So Armenians are part of it, but it is the immediate genocide. But Armenians had a movement that we can call feminist starting from 1860s. The first Armenian women's journal was published in Istanbul in 1862, actually. So it is fascinating how to really try to understand the change of how they changed the way they formulate what they want. Okay. So I am going to finish now. So this is just some of pictures. I'm just going to talk about this. This is the same woman, Haygan Uşmak, who published this, edited and published this book, this journal, Haygin, for 13 years. And it was closed down by the Turkish government in 1933, actually, because she was accused of having helped the enemies during the Armistice years. In 1954, when her husband dies, Ara Güler, this is his signature, you must have known her, the most famous photographer from Turkey, who happens to be Armenian, came to their house and took a picture with the sign of her beloved journal, whom she considered to be her daughter. So, in conclusion, I know it is time. Of course, this is not the end of the story, though. Why? Because, let me find my, yes. Because the differences from the previous era. So I talked about the continuities that allowed for transition of boundary making mechanisms, but there is a lot of difference that also allows Armenians to be able to imagine themselves as fitting to New Turkey, namely secularization, modernization, Western, I already signaled some of them. Radical Westernization. So just to give some examples, in terms of how Turkey chose Western Europe as the ultimate model to emulate, had reform in 1926, Fez abolished, Fedora instituted for men. The Sultanate was gone in 1922. The Caliphate, the institution of Caliphate, was abolished by the new Ankara government in 1924. In 1928, Islam was taken out of the Turkish constitution as the state religion. And like all religious minorities everywhere, Armenians, as well as other minorities, loved this promise of state neutrality towards religion. Women's veiling was discouraged, though not abandoned. This is the type of women that Mustafa Kemal himself associated with. This is a daughter, one of the adopted daughters of his, 1929, dancing modern dancers. The women on the background really with like exposing, showing skin. So all these changes, Armenians loved seeing them, which to many devout Muslims looked Christian if nothing else. Westernization reforms made Armenian lives easy. Secularization made their inclusion possible in a variety of ways. The lessening of Islam's prominent, however superficially, downplayed their fundamental difference, their Christianity, at least ostensibly. The Panama hat brought unanimity and thus anonymity. Ironically, the uncovering of Muslim women, at least in urban Istanbul that I studied, enabled non-Muslim women to cover their difference. In 1935, the state, this is the ultimate example, the state changed the official day of rest from Friday to Sunday. This change is a good summary of the irony of the Turkish secularist modernity. The same people who had actively contributed to the massacring of Ottoman Christians and continued to not to want them in the new Turkey were simultaneously adopting Western and Christian models and tastes in the name of laicite and higher civilization. In short, Kemalism promised an easier way, I argue, to pass as Turkish without necessarily turning into one, an ideal solution for Armenians who themselves did not aspire to become Turks anyway. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Okay, so I must.
So you stay here, please don't go anywhere.
Why don't you?
So I've been warned that when people are asking a question, that they wait for the microphone because we're having this videotaped and we want to make sure we get to you on the tape. Questions? Thank you.
Yes, no, it was great. Are you? Yes, your turn. Yeah. Yes, you do it. You do it. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Lerna, for your lecture. It was very interesting. I'm curious about the women survivors from the genocide who wound up in Istanbul. Did they have a different outlook on Armenianism than the ones who stayed in Istanbul from, whose families had been there for many generations? In other words, how was the survivor women, how did they sort of see themselves in this new milieu? Thank you.
The answer or okay.
I want to do this, but
Yes. So how are we doing time-wise? Just give me an idea when we need to vacate the room so that I paste it.
Until 7:30, so I think
Okay.
we're doing
Yes,
great.
yes.
It is
Yes.
getting a little stuffy because
I
they
know,
had to
yeah.
close the doors for the food. Maybe we could.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. I'm fine. I'm not gonna
If you
faint.
need air, please open the.
I mean, at one point we will need, I think. Yes, George. Yes, Gregory.
Yes,
Gregory
if you
of
could just
Tildilian,
briefly
right?
Introduce yourselves
Yes.
before the question. That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very important question, and it is partly something that I looked at in my previous work. and it sheds a lot of light into intra-Armenian differences. So the women who arrived as refugees, arrived to Istanbul as refugees in this until 1922, basically, are impoverished. Many times they are sick. Definitely, they have a child or a few children with them that they are not able. Like, they are in a very bad condition. Even if they might be coming from elite backgrounds in their original hometowns, they are now the underdog of the community, really. So there's a big hierarchy there. And they are in need of help. And on the other, we have these Constantinopolitan native women who might have been quite influential historical actors, but were not deported with the 250 intellectuals by April 24, 1915, only because they are women, right? So these patriarchal assumptions that are shared leaves a legacy, right? All 250 intellectual professionals that were deported from Istanbul were men. Right? There were 1 or 2 people in the list, and they escaped from Istanbul. So there's a lot of women out there now who are quite well trained in fundraising, orphanage care from previous massacres, basically. Keeping schools. Armenian women started opening up girls' schools since 1879 themselves, but not by the community, keeping it, having a board, finding money for tuition, all that. So they are there. So the interaction is varied, but many times I would say that it's against the benefit of the survivor. Because these survivors, I know it the best from the perspective of those women who were kidnapped before and rescued by this squads or pahavak groups. So some of these women either, first of all, did not want to be rescued, but they did. They were Armenians. And some others were pregnant, for instance, that didn't want to give birth because they were impregnated by the person who either raped them or like abused them for years. All these kind of stories. But the Armenian administration in Istanbul, which operated these shelters for these women, and the Armenian Red Cross, which was actually a women's organization in Istanbul, kept them, cared for them, and did not allow them, for instance, to have abortions. Like, they forced these women to have babies, basically, so that there were more Armenians at the end to people that land that they all hoped. So they have this already established province versus the capital hierarchy. Is then after the genocide kind of repeats itself. A lot of these women entered the houses of elite women, not just the women that I study, but the women as maids. There's a lot of maids and nannies from the refugees who worked in native Constantinopolitan households. What is interesting is that, of course, we don't know a lot about them. Like, they didn't write their stories as much as the elites from Constantinople wrote. Right? So these women who were survivors and found themselves in Istanbul many times come out in the memoirs of their sons or grandchildren in general. The way how the refugee camp was, the struggle of the mother to keep them united, or sometimes she had to place them in different orphanages, then the orphanages moved, the mothers tried to find them. But they also come up in the memoirs of these elite Constantinopolitan women. So very interestingly, Armenian men who were active in the Armenian administration during this time period don't focus too much on refugee women specifically when they don't act the way they were supposed to. Like, there were some some survivors of the genocide who were in Istanbul and consciously neglecting their kids so that they died. right? You don't see this in the patriarch's memoirs, other guys' memoirs, really, but you see this in these women's, that I call feminist women's memoirs, which they wrote in the beginning in 49, in the 50s they wrote. And many times they regret. It's a fascinating story because they imprisoned some of these women even just so that they give birth. And then they really almost have this testimony of saying that like, we shouldn't have done that. They change their mind, of course, because the immediacy of the moment is not there anymore.
There was a question there first.
Maybe a kind of follow-up question is about whether at the time that Armenian feminist movement started, or these smaller groups, were there Turkish feminist movement as well starting at the same time? And if so, how did the Armenian feminist movement related to them, or whether it was Armenian feminist movement that led to other feminist movements within their communities or surroundings?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So in the Ottoman Empire, the first women's journal was published by the Greeks. It's not surprising. The closer you are to the Western world, the earlier this Western and quite derivative of like national awakening, modern nationalism thing called feminism is going to happen. The girls' education, the importance of like raising these educated mothers discourse, basically. So Greeks had this journal, Kypseli, which means the bee, like the bee, queen bee, or that like this, what's it called? Aşkadaser, I'm talking, huh? The beehive, yes, beehive, yeah. This is also like homey, mother. Anyways, in 1849, which is very early, actually. But they don't continue. For a few years, they continued. Both amongst Greeks and Armenians and Bulgarians, but we will become the feminist movement starts as care for the poor relief activities. Again, like extension of this gender domestic role to the outside, to this whole your own community type of a thing. So Turkish women, of course, they had their own feminist movement around the same time with Armenians. In terms of, like, when I say feminine, like, in terms of really talking about fully participating as actors with agency to the national process, whatever it is. For Armenians, it's awakening, it's the Hartong, really. For Turks, it's yerel, milli, like there are different types of discourses that conservative nature that the Turkish women engage with. So there are moments of collaboration between them. The immediate aftermath of the 1908 Young Turk Revolution is a very important one. Everyone was collaborating, as Johannes knows, Kılıçdağı here, with everyone at this time, because it was a really, I mean, most people, it was celebrated so well. So Ottoman Armenian women and Ottoman Turkish women organized events to fundraise, for instance, for men who were exiled during the Hamidian era, to bring them back or to support their families, or so that they return and have an income. Of course, very short-lived, because things have changed quite frequently. But there is always interaction. Even though this is the reason why Melissa and I wrote the first book in Turkish in 2006, it has not been reflected in the Ottoman historiography until basically we wrote it. Because this was this assumption that Ottoman means Ottoman Turkish. I know why. You know, like the language issues, this general perception of the Turk as the Turkish Muslim, and the Ottoman being its predecessor. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of accusation by Armenian feminists in the aftermath of the genocide with regards to Turkish women's involvement in the genocide. Not just Kurdish women's active involvement during the deportations, massacres, but specifically young Turks, I mean, İttihadist leaders' wives, because this is their peers. So the feminists, Haygan Ushmark, Zaruy Kalemkerian, Zaruy Bahri, the women that I now study more in depth, they come from like families that they were connected with the Ottoman government. So they are these diplomat families, legal Like a lot of them, their families were involved in the Ottoman Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Translators Bureau. So they know the milieu of the Italians, right? And they keep saying in a few years after the end of the war that they could have prevented. Like they could have prevented. They could have prevented. Like they knew what. So their jewelry has blood on them. So there is this women-to-women accusation going on. Yeah, it's when impossibilities of collaboration are a lot visible. Yeah.
Just wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Alik Kristyanyan. I was wondering that the whole concept of gender roles and how that was served as a protectionary kind of measure, I think is really fascinating. And I'm wondering how you think that kind of translates into maybe the modern governments of Turkey and Armenia potentially, and how maybe women are seen and their roles are viewed now in the present day, and maybe if you can speak to that.
Yeah, it's always very difficult for me to answer these. Let me rephrase it. I'm curious where is this coming from. So I'm trying to understand what you are ultimately trying to understand, which is that there is this background of this gender division and the legacy of existential crisis that leads to conservatism, which is inevitable but unfortunate, but it's an effect of history. So under these conditions, for instance, for Armenians, is it possible, like, what is the second half of this question? How would you phrase it now?
How does the role of women, how has it changed, or how has it not changed, maybe, in both of these countries? And where do you see the trajectory going for women and the feminist movement in these countries? I know it's two very different countries I'm speaking of.
And I'm not going to talk about Turkey because it's a very different context.
Sure, but maybe just of Armenia.
Yes. I mean, it is a bit surprising for me to see that a lot of these things are still the same, especially in Armenia. Like the fact that in Turkey they are more or less the same doesn't surprise me, because Turkey continues to be the same, more or less, Turkey that it was in the 1920s and 30s, right? This paradox of being both an Armenian and a feminist in Turkey is not resolved. I cannot resolve it. I mean, I wrote the whole book to resolve it, but I then understood that you cannot resolve it because the infrastructural conditions are the same. But there is a country called Armenia that is free, and especially after the revolution, uber free now. So I am hoping that it will change after under this new government. I mean, you cannot change the society top down. I know, I'm not like you. But at the same time, models matter. I mean, the fact that current wife of the prime minister of Armenia has kept her own last name, Anna Hagopian, and not Pashkinyan, is very telling. And this same woman who has 4 kids, right? So, and who is only 4, like they married so early. They are so very traditional in general. But at the same time, they have a lot of like non-traditional, I know in the Soviet times, a lot of women kept their last names, but she insists after the revolution, after him becoming the prime minister, she was asked actually repeatedly, like, are you going to now change your last name? Should we refer to you as like Mrs. Pashinyan? It's like, no, I am an editor. She keeps she's the editor-in-chief of which was the main opposition newspaper, Armenian Times, for a long time. She's insisting that she'll keep it. She kind of reminds me of Michelle Obama, except it's not even Obama. You know, like she really is something that stands on her own. And we know that these role models matter. We have different projects, Audrey is here, in which we are trying to highlight some role models so that these already crystallized conceptions about what a girl is, what an Armenian woman can be, in what ways, like why it's not threatening for women to have both public roles and continue their domestic work is important. Like Anna Hagopian, who will visit us in Boston this week. Tomorrow she's coming to Boston, actually. She says in one of her interviews that, I'm not thinking of going into politics because I am so busy, and plus I have a lot of kids and I have to help my husband at home. So I want to remain hopeful.
So I've been given the green light for a couple of more questions, if you have any. Yes, please.
Hi. So you mentioned one of the community rights under Lausanne is about self-governance as a community political entity, and now we're seeing that become more and more contested with the death of the patriarch and like the pushing back of the elections. How do you think the Turkish government pressure on the patriarchate as an institution like changed from this era to the present day? And like, do you think the genocide experience shapes how the Armenian community tries to deal with that and pick more pro-government or silent leaders?
Yes, this is also another important question. Ohannes Kılıçdaroğlu. Should I, if there's someone here who has been a columnist, not only he's a historian, Ohannes Kılıçdaroğlu, but also have been a columnist for the Agos newspaper, Turkish Armenian Weekly, for more than a decade now? Yeah. Almost a decade? Yes, I mean, he knows more than me. Can you answer that? I mean, I'm not going to say anything that is better than what he's going to say.
I mean, let me try to paraphrase.
Microphone, yeah. Yes, and it is a very timely, I mean, as we speak, things are happening. Yeah, that's why I think it's very,
Here, I mean, I think the main point is that de jure and de facto treatment of Armenian Patriarchate is different. I mean, when you look at the Turkish law, you cannot find any law, any regulation, any bylaw regulating the character or responsibilities or authority of Armenian Patriarchate or Greek Patriarchate. So legally, in the Turkish Republic, there is no Patriarchate, Greek, Armenian, or it's also true for the Jewish community. But when you look at the practice or a state practice, you see that still patriarchates, patriarch, and personally, I mean, have been treating like the representatives of their communities. Just an example, for example, in official ceremonies, they are invited as the representative of their communities, or politicians, bureaucrats have meetings with them to discuss the communal problems. But again, still there is a crisis has been going on in Armenian Patriarchate for, let's say, for a decade almost, related to the election of patriarch. Again, similarly, there is no permanent law or regulation about how a patriarchate should be elected by civilians. This is a tradition in Armenian church. Patriarchs are elected by civilians. But as I say, state, always, I mean, Turkish state, avoids recognizing the official character or the official status of patriarchate. So basically, we should make a distinction between de jure and de facto situation. De jure, there is no patriarchate. De facto, it's accepted as the representatives of community. So in a sense, we can say that millet system is gone officially, but practically it's still going on at a certain extent. I mean, I don't know whether this is just is a framework, maybe it's sufficient or not.
I think it continues that, I mean, the Turkish government does care about the patriarch, for sure. Which is actually, I think, if we denaturalize the situation and like have a distance, is interesting because there are how many Armenians? 60,000 at most, more or less. Armenians in a 75 million Turkey.
82 now.
Oh, sorry, this book talk is from 3 years ago. they reproduce a lot. So it is, I mean, why do they care that much? Because of historical reasons. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lerna.
Thank you. Thank you.